Hello.
Hello.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Thank you for joining our session today on the implications of COVID-19 regarding peace and security and the living conditions of millions of people in Syria and Yemen. The session is titled War and Disease, Living with COVID-19 in Yemen and Syria. My name is Tarek Sharkawi, and I'm the manager of TRT World Research Center. It is, of course, a tragic situation. It's not only just tragic, it's complex and multifaceted situation that we live nowadays in Syria and Yemen. The crisis, unfortunately, has taken many shapes and many forms. And in this session today, we aim to take a deep dive to this subject and try to dissect the implications that are already underway in both countries, and which COVID-19 has given even further complications. It has implications on the conflict itself, the conflicts unfolding in both countries. It has implications on the people. It has implications on the societal fabric. It has implications on foreign relations and international relations. And it has deep implications on the state capabilities and on the prospects for peace and security moving forward. The numbers are really staggering. In Syria, 500,000 at least have been killed in 10 years of conflict. There are at least 7 million internally displaced population within Syria. There are about at least 5 million refugees from Syria overseas. Let's not forget about the water supplies, the medical facilities that have been routinely targeted, and the continuance of the suffering in Syria. In Yemen, the situation is dire. I mean, the UN has dubbed the situation in 2019 as the worst humanitarian crisis and the worst cholera outbreak of modern history. 14 million people are in acute humanitarian need. 10 million people are one step away from famine and starvation. That said, I'm very pleased that we have today a number of distinguished panelists who can break down the complexity of the situation at hand. They are perfectly located to dissect the current dynamics and humanitarian implications, as well as to give some prognosis on the situation moving forward, and whether there could be any settlement to the conflicts currently underway. I'm delighted to welcome the panelists. I would like to welcome Nadwa Al-Dawsari. She's a non-resident fellow at the Middle East Institute. She was the Yemen director for the Center for Civilians in Conflict and a senior non-resident fellow at the Project on Middle East Democracy and the founder director of Partners Yemen. Also, I would like to welcome our distinguished panelist, Dr. Nasr Al-Hariri. He is the president of the Syrian National Coalition of the Syrian Revolution and opposition forces. He comes from a medical background, which is gonna be very important for this session. And he worked in various senior capacities in medical facilities in Syria. He also has a lot of involvement with NGOs dealing with whether the medical situation or other NGOs dealing with the political situation. Also, I would like to welcome our third panelist, the distinguished Abdulghani Al-Iryani. He is a senior researcher at the Sana'a Center for Strategic Studies. He is a political and development consultant. He has done research on various subjects and has consulted for a number of important international organizations such as the World Bank, USAID, UNDP, and others. Thank you, gentlemen and ladies, and Mrs. Nadwa Dawsari for being with us today. I also acknowledge the participation of several distinguished discussants. Mr. Salman Sheikh, CEO of the Sheikh Group. We have also with us Bara Shayban. He's a human rights activist and researcher at Reprieve Organization UK. We have with us Ibrahim Olabi. He is a barrister at Guernica 37 International Justice Chambers in the UK. We have with us as well Mr. Christian Brakel from the Heinrich Böll Stiftung, and he's country director Turkey for this organization. Also with us, Mr. Obaida Hito, he's a TRT World correspondent, and Ömer Özgelzik, researcher at SETA. The format of the discussion today is one that I hope would be a lot of conversation and draw interactions between the panelists and, of course, between the panelists and the discussants. Panelists are each given between 8 to 10 minutes to give their opening remarks. This will be followed by 60 minutes of discussion. When the panelists finish their opening remarks, discussants will have the chance to ask questions and make comments. Please make sure that the comments and the questions are related to today's topic, and make sure to contribute to the flow of the discussion. And the speakers, of course, will have a chance to respond to and on their initial opening remarks. So without further ado, I would like to invite, because ladies first, Mrs. Nadwa Dawsari for your opening remarks. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I was actually expecting to be the last speaker, but that's okay. So before I talk about COVID in Yemen, I would like to give an idea about the humanitarian situation that COVID have exacerbated. This is a country that has been at war for 6 years, and as you said, it's become the world's worst humanitarian crisis as a result. 80% of the population need humanitarian assistance or protection, and Yemen has the 4th largest number of displaced persons in the world, with about 4 million Yemenis displaced as a result of the fighting, a pattern that unfortunately continues. And 2/3 of all Yemenis are hungry, and nearly half do not know when they will eat next. And one indicator that's relevant to COVID-19 is that the water infrastructure operate with less than 5% efficiency. 70% of the population do not have access to drinking water, let alone, to wash their hands for 20 seconds. The health infrastructure have taken a major hit as a result of the war, with many health facilities destroyed by either airstrikes or ground fighting. And lack of resources also have affected the way these health facilities function. Most health workers in Yemen have been without salary for years now, since mid-2016. 65% of the Yemeni population have no access to healthcare, and less than 50% of the health facilities operate with serious shortage in medicine, equipment, and staff. The entire Yemeni health sector is not equipped to deal with COVID-19. In fact, the MSF, Doctors Without Borders, started clinics back in April throughout Yemen, specifically to address this gap. And they've trained health workers throughout the country. But MSF itself was before bombed 4 times in airstrikes. So not specifically related to COVID, but health facilities continue to be vulnerable to during the war. COVID added insult to injury. So during the first half of 2020, the floods particularly in the south, devastated communities, fueling the spread of other killer diseases, so cholera, dengue fever, malaria, and diphtheria. COVID-19 cases spiked during May, June, but they subsided later in the summer. But the UN experts now say that there might be a resurge. Now, the most devastating impact of COVID-19 is economic. Remittances declined by 80% during the first 4 months of 2020, as many Yemenis living abroad lost their jobs as a result of COVID-19. Now, remittances in Yemen are important because they are the main source of income for most Yemenis. Official figures say that Yemeni remittances reached $3.8 billion in 2019, but informal sources say it actually reached $10 billion during that same year. So without that, many families found themselves without income and vulnerable. So how Yemenis responded to COVID? Yemenis defied every measure against COVID, every measure to prevent COVID-19. So there was no quarantine, attempts to lock down failed, and they did not take place. Yemenis pretty much, went about their business as COVID did not exist. Many Yemenis live on informal economy, so they cannot afford lockdowns. They cannot afford to quarantine. And many Yemenis take comfort from the horrors of the war in socializing. So they continue to socialize, and as the virus didn't exist. When wedding halls were closed down by local authorities throughout Yemen to prevent the spread of COVID, Yemenis did their wedding anyways in their homes. So the good news is that there hasn't been a surge of COVID in Yemen. I spoke to some health workers recently, and they said there hasn't been any surge so far, but that might change. But the point is that in Yemen, it's not about COVID. It's not about the deaths that the virus causes. It's more about the conditions that it exacerbates, and that leads to much more suffering than just the deaths. As tragic as it is to say that, but this is what's happening in Yemen. So I'll leave it at that, and I'll take any questions later. Thank you.
Thank you for your initial comments. They are very, very informative indeed, and they show a very different trajectory of the COVID situation. So we'll move to the next panelist. Dr. Nasr Al-Hariri is next. So can you please share with us your thoughts?
Yes, thank you very much. Hello, everybody. I am very pleased to join you this session about war and disease, COVID-19 and Syria. And I think that the situation is not so different from that situation in Yemen, al-Shaqiq, brother Yemen. You know that the Syrian people's decision to join the Arab Spring was a positive step to rebuild Syrians' institutions and enable the country to fight off the various challenges facing all countries around the world today. However, Al-Assad regime and its allies chose to destroy the country instead of conceding to the will of the Syrian people. Instead of being prepared to tackle the COVID-19 pandemic, Syria now lies in ruins with massive destruction of infrastructure and healthcare facilities. Mass forced displacement and demographic change has also forced thousands of doctors and medical personnel to leave Syria in order to escape the bombing, crackdown, and execution. Local and international research centers and institutions, the World Health Organization, and other international organizations are providing detailed figures on the situation on the ground and the humanitarian needs in the regime-held and freed territory alike. The first coronavirus infection in the area administered by the Syrian interim government was recorded on July 9, 2020. The infections have surged in recent weeks. According to figures published by the ACU, Assistance Coordination Unit, and the Early Warning and Response Network on November 30. At least what we have of numbers until this moment, at least 60,000 cases have been recorded so far, of which about 8,000 fully recovered, while the number of confirmed deaths reach 166. In the IDP camps, there have been 9 deaths out of 935 positive cases, and total of 55,000 tests have so far been conducted in the Northwest, while more than 1,000 tests are being conducted on a daily basis. The majority of the infected cases are aged between 15 and 45-year-old. Healthcare officials and the Syrian interim government regularly issue instructions and carry out awareness raising campaigns. However, the situation in the ground is dire, as many civilians don't abide by the preventive measures because the majority of these people are in a huge need to work, to earn money, to run their issues, and to spend on their families, as they are working on daily basis if they have the opportunity to get some work. There is an urgent for stepping up support for the healthcare sector in Syria, especially in the IDP camps. There is a pressing need for more isolation centers and shelters, sufficient medicines and sterilization equipment, and humanitarian material support for people who are in self-isolation. There is also a pressing need for more medical aid at home, both in the regime-held and free territories, as well as in the areas under the control of the terrorist PYD militias. We can't let our people down wherever they are. Syria everywhere are our people, and we are the only party seriously and truly responsible for their safety and well-being. And in this text, it is imperative to prevent the Assad regime and other parties or militias from controlling the flow of aid or manipulating its distribution. It is imperative also to ensure that medical aid and means of protection against the coronavirus reach all those in need everywhere in Syria and without any discrimination. There is a pressing need for increased deliveries for aid to Idlib and its countryside, especially to the hundreds of IDP camps, the majority of which were hastily set up and sheltering hundreds of thousands of displaced people who are suffering severe cold and acute shortage of resources, job opportunities, and means of livelihood. Of paramount importance is also the provision of vaccines as soon as they are available safely and in accordance with international health standards. Meeting these needs will certainly have lasting economic, social, and humanitarian impact on the displaced communities, cities, and towns across Syria. International intervention here in the political intervention is for purely health, social, and humanitarian reasons that are based on a balanced political stance aimed at putting an end to the conflict and ensuring the implementation of international resolutions. We are all aware of the need for a political solution in Syria as the only way to resolve the mounting crisis, achieve a transition in Syria in an era of rebuilding the society, the state, and healthcare facilities. In the face of these enormous challenges, we can't be on the right path before a political transition is put in place. We hope that humanitarian organizations and bodies, as well as civil society organizations, will support political transition in Syria in accordance with the UN resolutions. Thank you very much, and I'll be ready soon to answer any question you want.
Thank you very much for these points. I would like to give the floor now to Mr. Abdulghani Al-Iryani. The floor is all yours. Thank you.
Thank you. I will cover the impact of COVID in areas under control by the Houthi movement, the de facto authorities in Sana'a, since my colleague Nadwa Dawsari has already covered the overall impact and the economic impact. First, we have to be very clear that there are no reliable data. The government and the de facto authority both claim very small numbers of cases. And overall, the number of deaths that they have recognized is maybe accounts for half of it is accounted for by the frontline workers. Over 100 doctors and frontline workers have died of COVID-19 in Sana'a hospitals alone. And so what we can deduce with any credibility is from talking to doctors and frontline workers in the ground, and they actually portray a very dim and very sad picture. When the first cases of COVID appeared, it was quickly announced in Aden, but in Sana'a, the de facto authorities continued to deny the existence of COVID cases for about 2 months, during which time it spread very quickly, and then the de facto authorities then took measures, very harsh measures of quarantining and the closing neighborhoods and so on, posting armed armed guards in front of suspected houses of suspected cases, rounding up families and putting them in crowded quarantine facilities that in which basically they made it certain that they will not only catch COVID-19 but also other endemic viral disease such as dengue or diphtheria. Those who were positively diagnosed were taken to the COVID ward in Kuwait hospital, where many of them died on the second or third day of their admission, triggering rumors that the authorities are containing the disease by a death injection. While I don't think that is the case, it was really unfortunate that the facilities did not help the patients, and they died shortly after admission, but also triggered a panic and fear in the society. So they stopped reporting cases in their homes. People just died in their homes. They were never reported. Often their death would be attributed to a heart attack or something, because they fear that the authorities will round up the family and put them in unsanitary quarantine facilities. So we really don't know how many died, and we don't know how many cases hit these areas or Yemen in general. And the shortage of tests is also a problem. So from my personal investigation, talking to health workers in the past few months, I managed to establish that by July, August, around 5,000 people have died of COVID-19 in Sana'a city alone, and the surrounding countryside. And that is, given that the Sana'a population is around 4 million people now, due to the internal displacement, and that is 20% of the population under Houthi control. That indicates that the mortality of the population and the total population has reached around 25,000 by July to August. And overall, by now, I think it will have reached the number that was projected in the very onset of COVID-19 by UN agencies, which was 80,000 fatalities in Yemen in the course of the pandemic. Since the beginning, the social distancing did not happen really. Masks and sanitizers appeared in Sana'a for a while, then disappeared. People just gave up. But right now, the number of cases has gone down markedly, and very few cases are being reported by my contacts in recent weeks. There's only one explanation for that. The only reasonable explanation is that Yemen has reached herd immunity. So hopefully there will be no second wave. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this edifying comments. I think we have now with the three panelists some substance to work with and to start a very informative discussion. I would like to start with you, Mr. Salman Sheikh. I think you have a very distinctive background. You have been at the same time director of a prestigious think tank, the Brookings Institution. You have been director of that, the Doha Center, for quite some time. And plus, you are also a peacemaker, and you have been associated with various peacemaking exercises, and you work with grassroots organizations. So, taking into consideration what our panelists have said, what is your take, and where can we go from here?
To be with you, Tariq, and with these esteemed panelists. It's very good to see Dr. Nasr Hariri in particular, as well as the other two distinguished panelists, as well as to join the other fellow discussants. I have 2 or 3 points which I wanted to raise, particularly on Syria, but let's start with a general point. It is the fact that we still don't have a very clear handle on the actual data when it comes to COVID in Syria and in Yemen. And as the panelists have explained, this is partly to do with the lack of capacity, but it's also to do with the behavior of the authorities or the various authorities in these places. In the case of Syria, it's been quite clear that the Assad regime has sought to not only downplay this, but also to try to manipulate aid in this as this epidemic has taken root. Of course, this is no surprise because it hasn't really cared for the vast majority of the Syrian people in any case, and neither for that matter healthcare workers and hospitals. I think more than 350 attacks have been shown in that respect. Secondly, and here I particularly address it to Dr. Nasr, the UN route. Of course, we know the failures of the Security Council in restricting the number of border crossings. It's inexcusable that in the middle of a global pandemic, we went from 4 to 2 to 1 border crossing into northwest, and particularly in northwest Syria, where we just have one for more than 4 million people. That's inexcusable. But what does this say about the UN and the UN Security Council? And should we not be thinking a bit more about how we can galvanize at least a coalition of the willing in the international community to not just to open up those crossings, but to look for alternative ways if the aid has to continue to go through the UN in Damascus. And linked to that, and it's a broader point, I guess it applies to Yemen as well, is it not time for us to look at the international humanitarian system? Of course, nobody's really got it right when it comes to this awful pandemic and COVID, but there are various degrees of responses. And I do ask myself, particularly again with regard to Syria, but I think it could also apply to Yemen, how is it that armed conflict has continued to ride completely over the bodies of civilians in Syria and in Yemen? We have, of course, a rich body of international humanitarian law, which started with the rebirth of this after the Second World War with the UN, with the Geneva Conventions. We've had these additional protocols focused on civilian protection, but even those are 40 years old. And warfare has evolved, it's asymmetrical, it's within countries, it's not just between countries. Isn't it time that we looked at the international humanitarian system of laws and again, look to see how we can bring, if it's not possible, a broader multilateral group of countries, and I hope it is possible, especially with the Biden administration and others trying to revive multilateralism. But if that's so, a coalition of the willing that would be seeking to make sure that what has happened in Syria in the last 10 years, in the humanitarian grave breaches, violations which have occurred, war crimes, as well as, I would say, in Yemen, does not continue to happen over and over again. And I believe COVID has been has shown up these pre-existing conditions. And one of the pre-existing conditions is that our international humanitarian system is broken, and we need to renew it and revive it. I would welcome the panelists' response to those. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your intervention. It's very, very informative. I think there is a question there for Dr. Nasr Al-Hariri, if you could respond to the questions asked by Mr. Salman Sheikh. And I think also he raised the broader questions of the weaponization of this COVID-19 to inflict even more restrictions on whether on border crossings and on other forms of restrictions on the civilian population. I think there is there is something there that we could definitely answer. So, Dr. Nasr Al-Hariri, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a very great pleasure, my friend Salman, to see you. And in this regard, I want to thank TRT Forum to give us this opportunity to see you after a little bit long time. Yes, I agree with you that it is unfortunate now to see after 10 years of conflict inside Syria, after the humanitarian burden on the Syrian interim government and the coalition and the actors in the humanitarian field, after all of this crisis, we see again two catastrophes. First, COVID-19. Second, again, recurrent veto done by Russia and China to prevent the broader crossing of humanitarian delivery to the Syrian people. Although, to speak frankly, that there was a great effort in the Security Council to try to widen or to increase the number of border points as an access of humanitarian aid, but unfortunately, the problems inside the Security Council was bigger than these sincere efforts. And the result now is put on the Syrian people itself. Because while we know exactly how unable was the UN in tackling with the humanitarian issue in Syria, and they have admitted many times that the volume of humanitarian access, which is specialized to the Syrian people, is very low, and it only covers about 24% of the general humanitarian aid needed inside Syria. So now the Syrian people in the northwest of Syria are suffering from many aspects. First, the most malign and dangerous virus, which is Bashar al-Assad and Russia and Iran, and you can frankly and obviously current or continuous military campaigns targeting and Idlib countryside. Not only Idlib, even we have seen military bombing on Al-Bab city, for example, 2 months ago. And it was also a bombing targeting a headquarter of Faylaq al-Sham, which is a main component of the Syrian National Army, just close to the Syrian Turkish border. So from one side, we have the continuous military campaigns against the Syrian people. From the other side, we have COVID-19. From the third side, we have the tough winter. And I want to mention that we have at least in the liberated areas in northwest of Syria, we have 1,160 of camps. In these camps, we have at least 1.5 million of IDPs are living in these camps. From these camps, we have 400 are irregular. So people are living without shelter between olive trees without any humanitarian reach to these people. We are trying our best to outreach our friends in the Security Council to try to raise again the issue of providing humanitarian aid to Syrian people in general, and not only send the international community humanitarian aid through the Syrian regime, and we know how the Syrian regime is dealing with these humanitarian. In addition to that, I want to mention that the Syrian regime was a main cause of distributing of this COVID-19 outbreak in Syria, because he was keen to continue opening from Tehran to Damascus to have more fighters to join the Al-Assad regime in his military preparations in Idlib and its surrounding areas. And you all of us know well how big was the number of infected cases in Tehran. So this continuous movement from Tehran to Damascus was also a mean to distribute more the number of infected cases of COVID-19 inside Syria. And the regime, as my friend said from Yemen, the regime has practiced in the same manner of Al-Houthi because he denied from the beginning the number of cases inside Syria, and he prevented any steps or any precautionary steps regarding this COVID, because the regime was not able to tolerate the economic pressure from having quarantining or social distancing or other procedures against COVID-19. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your comments. I will take now a question from Mr. Bara Shayban, and then we will have both Ömer and Ibrahim in succession. So, Bara, please ask your question.
Thank you so much. Thanks for all the panelists. And I would like to explore further regarding the weaponizing of the COVID-19. As we saw in regards to some areas in Yemen. When we talk about the Houthis, for example, what we saw is that they considered this as an information warfare from the beginning. So they tried as much as possible deny access and deny the existence of the outbreak, because they felt from the beginning there's going to be an over access for the international humanitarian agencies into the areas they control. Then we saw also an emerging of mass graves that were happening that night, and these mass graves, unfortunately, were done in a way to pressure the community, not to announce that these deaths are related to COVID-19. It reached to the level that even the doctors in Sana'a, in a joint letter, and that was the first of its kind, that they signed a joint letter asking the Houthis to open access for information. Now the situation in Aden, we saw also a similar form of warfare. But the way how the STC, the Southern Transitional Council, dealt with the situation is that they tried to use it to legitimize its authority. So it tried to be the distributor of humanitarian aid, the distributor of some of the medical facilities that have arrived by the WHO and others, in order, in a way, to exercise some authority on the ground. My question is more of if both Nadwa and Abdulghani would try to explore further. How would it look like if we have an outbreak? And I think it couldn't be more worse to have an outbreak during a conflict. If we have further outbreaks of further pandemics, if the current scale of lack of institutions keep deteriorating in the way that we are seeing in Yemen, what is at stake really? What are we, let's say, expecting in the future in 2021 or 2022?
All right, who would like to take the questions, Abdulghani or Nadwa?
I will start. I think that
Okay.
there is a basic, very bitter fact at play in Yemen. The law of natural selection is taking its course. So I don't think a second wave or another pandemic of any sort will find as many vulnerable victims as the first wave has found. Of course, if we get a pandemic that young, hungry children will be more susceptible to, then that will be massive, because we have around 8 million starving children. But in terms of a second wave of COVID-19, I don't think that it's going to kill as many people. The system is totally destroyed. The aerial bombing and fighting and targeting of health facilities by both parties has been very common. Not only that, health facilities have no salaries, no fuel to run their machines, no electricity, no water. So in effect, they are unable to do anything. And therefore, we can speak with the understanding that beside health facilities provided by MSF and other donors, the local health facilities are have totally collapsed.
All right. Do we have any further comments from Nadwa?
No, I mean, I'm hoping that Abdulghani's theory is accurate. In a way, I tend to think that Yemenis have developed herd immunity, but maybe that's just me trying to cope with all the bad news coming from Yemen. But I hope it is the case. I agree. If an outbreak happens, it could kill a lot of people. And I will not repeat what Abdulghani said, but I'm just hoping that it won't happen.
Okay. So we will take the discussion to Mr. Omer. We have seen so far like some divergent positions. I mean, between COVID, whether it's like the problem is COVID itself, or the problem is more like economic of nature, and people are, you know, in a very kind of precarious situation economically, which is much worse than the actual pandemic. And we do have like pessimistic people and optimistic people. And we do have also regimes and other forces like the Houthis weaponizing the discourse, or weaponizing the whole COVID situation to enforce more authority or gain more legitimacy on the ground. So in your research, I know you are very much involved in research in Syria, and you have been there many times. What is your take? How do you see these things?
So first of all, thanks for this great opportunity and this discussion here. But I personally think that we have to be a bit more realistic about the COVID pandemic in war zones like Syria and Yemen. For instance, if we only look at official numbers, the deaths due to the COVID pandemic are lower than the deaths caused by car bomb terror attacks in Syria conducted by the YPG terror group. So, however, I do not want to decrease the importance of COVID, but I want to stress out that we have to address the issue correctly. So, for instance, one of the major aspects in fight against the COVID pandemic is social distancing. But anyone who visited the areas in Syria's north under the control of the Syrian opposition will know that this is not possible, because quite frankly, the areas controlled by the Syrian opposition have a population growth of over 230%. So this is incredible. So the people are living in camps, in makeshift areas. There's a so big accumulation of people that it's quite frankly impossible for the people to social distance. And COVID is just one of their problems in their normal lives. There's economic problem, there's lack of infrastructure, and there is the need for security, which in turn lets me to ask this question. The war in Syria has been continuing for almost 10 years, and it will continue. I do not have much hope that it will end soon. So we have to ask ourselves, how can we protect civilians? And how can we achieve this? And I think here we have to find ways to circumvent the United Nations, because the United Nations have become a tool of taking civilians hostage for political gains rather than to solve and ease the problems for civilians. Therefore, I think whenever I think about the living conditions in Syria's north under the control of Syrian opposition, that we need investment in these areas, that we need protection, and this requires military engagement like Turkey is doing, and this requires to build up homes for the civilians, because if the territory under the control of Syrian opposition would be used properly, and there would be proper investment in infrastructure and housing, that we would have a much higher standard of living, and that this would facilitate economy, this would facilitate healthcare, and this would also facilitate the work in fighting against the COVID pandemic. But at the very moment, I think for a regular Syrian civilian who lives in an IDP camp in Syria's north, in Atmer or in Azaz, he does not care much about the COVID pandemic, because for him, this is just of the minor problems he faces in real life. So my question would be, might be this COVID pandemic be a reminder or a facilitator to think of ways how to circumvent the United Nations and build up proper safe zones for civilians, especially when there is already an accumulation of population in certain areas.
All right, thank you very much for your questions. We will ask it as soon as we take Mr. Ibrahim's take on the issue, and then I'll move to Obaida and Christian. So please be prepared.
We can't hear you, Ibrahim. Ibrahim,
Hello?
we can't hear you.
Yes,
now we
okay.
can hear
Can you hear me now?
I can't hear you. I think you have to open your mic. Yes, now we can.
Excellent. Perfect. So I just want to make a couple of quick points on Syria. The first point that which needs kind of a little bit more focus is the issue of detention, particularly in regime cells, because the detention tens of thousands of people who are still detained and tortured as we speak has one or many hallmarks, but one of them is how crowded these detentions are and how people have to sleep very closely to each other and sleep in corridors and get tortured in group sessions. And so it is expected, obviously we don't have the numbers for these, that in regime detention cells of those who are being who have been arbitrarily detained and forced to disappear and tortured, COVID is a real disaster to start with. The second point is linked to sanctions, right? Because there were there still are unilateral sanctions from Europe and the US on the Syrian regime and its allies. And what we've seen is the politicization of sanctions by the regime and their allies to link what their COVID response ability to the fact that they are listed or they are subject to Western sanctions. And this is, I mean, sanctions could be one factor that is contributing to that, but it's obviously the way the regime conducted itself over the last year, bombing hospitals and targeting doctors, in persecuting healthcare professionals, in spending the money on the war efforts that led to its inability to deal with COVID. Also, important to note that both European and US sanctions include humanitarian exemptions, clear humanitarian exemptions for things like ventilators and other humanitarian needs. So it's interesting to see how this issue of sanctions, which is a hot topic, is being used in the COVID discussion as a political tool to say lift the sanctions off the Syrian regime. The third thing I want to quickly mention is that the way COVID is contagious and the way it is spreading all over Syria, this is not just a problem for Syria. This is potentially a problem in the entire world if we have a second refugee wave. Even if you get vaccinations in Europe and in the West, if the truce breaks down in Idlib, and Russia not hold its word, and we get the second refugee crisis, and the West doesn't do anything supporting Turkey and upholding the truce in the northwest, then COVID might respread in Europe. So this is the problem, which I think requires a lot of focus and should lead actors within the Security Council to act unilaterally, because it will affect whether or not there is a veto at some point in that. My final point is with regard to this Syria and the entire world, which is disinformation campaign. So disinformation campaigns, has been the kind of hallmark of the Syrian conflict of, Russian propaganda and regime propaganda, supported by West people who are kind of funded by these actors to say it's a war on terror, all of this. It was fascinating for me to see that the same people spreading misinformation and disinformation about Syria are the same people that are spreading misinformation and disinformation about and the impact of vaccines and how this is all a conspiracy and killers, all of that. Clearly saw that the disinformation campaigns that Russia led, that were not given enough attention to by the West, is backfiring on them when it comes to regulations for vaccine conspiracy theories.
Okay, thank you very much for these comments. We will definitely direct them to the panelists at a subsequent stage. For now, we will take Obaida and then Mr. Christian.
Thank you, Dr. Tariq, and thank you all for taking the time to join us on this program. And I feel humbled to be amongst such great panelists and people of such great esteem. I appreciate you being in attendance again. It would be helpful if our guest who wasn't able to make it from the UN, Mr. Mark Cutts, specifically on the Syria topic, because there's a lot of questions about this issue, and some of them I will discuss. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to attend. It would have been great to hear his perspective on some of these issues. The first issue I will address is something that some of the panelists have already discussed, and maybe Dr. Nasr can expand more when the mic gets back to him. The regime has actually been using the issue of humanitarian aid for its own politics long before the issue of COVID-19 came into effect. First of all, the regime has denied repeatedly attacking medical facilities in Syria, despite all of the evidence that has been gathered and put into the public sphere about the direct and deliberate targeting of medical facilities, medical workers. Have agencies have failed thus far to actually put any kind of punishment in place or any kind of restrictions on the regime to stop these kinds of attacks. And it wasn't until the spring of 2020 that these kinds of attacks, this spring of 2020 actually, that these kinds of attacks stopped happening. All of 2019, and if you go back in the history, all of 2018, Assad and Russia used that time to attack medical facilities and completely destroy the medical infrastructure. And then when COVID-19 showed up in Syria, it completely overwhelmed the decimated medical infrastructure. And until now, the Syrians who are inside Syria working in the medical sector are struggling to keep up with the demand for general medical attention for the population there. Only in Idlib, there's about 4 million people. 80% of the 1.5 million displaced people are women and children. All of these people need medical attention, but they're not able to get that, whether they have COVID-19 or not. So this is something that has compounded the situation for those people in northwest Syria. I'm reading some numbers from the UNHCR, and even though the UN has made some effort to, send aid and different kinds of other support to northwest Syria, opposition-controlled Syria, and other parts of opposition-controlled Syria and northern Aleppo, 214,000 masks were sent between March and October of 2020. 212,000 masks are not going to last one day in northern Syria. And if the UN really wants to help these areas get the COVID-19 pandemic under control, it really needs to rethink how it's going to be delivering aid to Syria and possibly conditioning aid, for example, that's going to regime areas on stipulated on the release of detainees, as our friend Ibrahim has mentioned, are being detained in very deplorable conditions and making it very easy for the COVID-19 virus to spread among detainees. So we haven't seen this kind of very thorough discussion on the UN level, at the international level. We've seen a lot of non-state actors influencing how the UN acts, and the regime influencing how the UN acts, and Russia influencing how the UN acts. But the humanitarian demands on the ground, it doesn't seem like, are driving how the UN is addressing the situation in Syria. I can't speak so much as to the situation in Yemen, but our guests from Yemen have kind of painted a similar picture. The Houthis are controlling the narrative. They're controlling the information that's leaving Yemen to the outside world and reaching the UN, possibly even. And so the situation on the ground continues to get worse while the world is saying, oh, well, we don't have enough information to decide on how to move forward. The other issue that I wanted to address here is basically the idea that Mr. Salman al-Sheikh mentioned. He said that maybe it's time that we rethink the way that the international humanitarian system works. And I think that the situation in Syria is really a testament to that, because the UN and the UN humanitarian agencies throughout the conflict in Syria have been working to the favor of the Assad regime, because all of the UN official offices are based, or at least at the high level, are based in Damascus, which is under the Assad regime control. And everything in terms of funding and decisions on how the UN operates in Syria is approved and decided through its office in Damascus in coordination with its office in Geneva. And in a place where, like Syria, where there are different spheres of control, we haven't even spoken about Eastern Syria, where the YPG, the PKK Syria wing, is in cooperation with the United States, despite the Turkish and the Syrian regime and Iran and Russia's rejection of that. And so you can see how complicated this is, and how complicated it would be for the UN to try and be equal or be fair in the way that it approaches these different state and non-state actors and the different situations in these different areas, which are actually geographically connected, but now theoretically are separated by these lines of demarcation. So the situation in Syria is quite complicated. I don't think that the situation is similar to Yemen in the sense that, like Mr. Al-Iryani said, that there isn't going to be a second wave. We're still not sure about the numbers in northern Syria. We're not sure about the numbers in the regime territories. But what we have seen is that since April, there has been an increase in numbers in opposition-controlled areas, verified by testing and verified by groups that are working specifically on finding out where these cases are and trying to isolate them. But the resources are limited, and the situation, I think, is far bigger than any one individual or organization or even the UN can handle at this point. And that's why I think I'll go back to Mr. Salman al-Sheikh's suggestion that there has to be a new way to deal with these very convoluted conflicts. And I think that they're going to increase in the future. So it might be a good time to sit back and say, how are we going to approach the humanitarian crises in these kinds of conflicts in the future? Okay,
I think
absolutely.
we are going to move to Herr Christian.
Go ahead. If you let me talking, I won't stop.
Yeah, so
I can't control myself.
We'll come back to you. We'll come back to you. So, Herr Christian, what is your take? I mean, you are very much, vested into the study of refugees and refugee flows, and you have devoted a lot of time and energy into helping refugees and studying the root causes of the problem. So, what are your questions, and do you have any comments to make?
Thank you very much. Thank you also for this interesting conversation so far. There were a lot of good points that some of them I would like to pick up on. One thing, the first thing is that I have a very practical question to Dr. Nasr. You mentioned the prevalence of COVID cases and both infections and deaths in Syria. And I was wondering if there is actually a difference in the number of infections and the number of deaths, given how this is handled in the different areas, in the areas under regime control, in the areas controlled by the Syrian opposition, in the areas where the YPG is in charge, or in the areas under Turkish occupation. If there is actually a difference, or it's just more or less the same because more or less the same dire conditions prevail. And then I wanted also to go back, same as the previous speaker, to the comments of Mr. Al-Sheikh. I think you're very, very right. I mean, we've seen, especially in Syria, I think to a lesser extent in Yemen, but especially in Syria, is not only like the breakdown of the international humanitarian system and how dysfunctional it is. I mean, it was just mentioned that especially not only the dependence on the Security Council, but also the dependence on the Syrian regime makes humanitarian principles, I mean, of impartiality basically moot. And maybe also impartiality in a conflict like this is not really what we need, because the different warring sides are not equal. But I also think that if we look at it from a broader perspective, I mean, the breakdown of the international humanitarian system, and especially the situation in Syria, I think can only be understood in not a complete breakdown, but at least like very, very big cracks in the international order that have emerged over the last at least 10 years. And these come with, like, together with a global rise in a disrespect for international law, a disrespect for human rights, the rise of authoritarian strongmen. We have seen that in the US with President Trump. We have seen that in Europe. Of course, we have seen it in the Middle East. And I also have to mention that we have seen that in Turkey, unfortunately. And I think it's very hard to decouple these things from one another. And I think while a lot of people disagree that the system currently is dysfunctional, even the UN, I mean, if you talk with UN officials working on Syria behind closed doors, I mean, people are very, very frank about that they are not in favor of the current system. But what I have problems with was what Mr. Özkilic suggested, and that is undermining the international order to accomplish results. I think what we need is to strengthen the international order, to come back to a system that is based on international norms and laws and regulations that actually work and that they deliver just and fair and equal treatment for populations in affected areas. But I mean, this is also, and I think maybe Mr. Sheikh has an idea on that, I think what we're all struggling with is how to do that. Because it seems there is a lack of political will from all sides, and not only like from authoritarian leaders in the region, but also from major powers. I mean, I think we're all hoping that some things might change now after the US elections, but I mean, it's not that the US has always delivered like to these aspirations. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. This is very, very edifying comments. And yeah, I would like to continue with you, Mr. Salman Sheikh. I think we have heard some quite important comments from other discussants. For example, why like, okay, you have this point of the coalition of the willing, and we have a new president of the international community. Uh, there have been some other suggestions like the sanctions. Some of our discussants, they said that how about having safe zones? You have worked in peacemaking and trying to be part of some of the tracks in Syria, and you worked with the international community, some international organization with grassroots. What do you see? I mean, is this a possibility, or because of the realpolitik, we will never be able to apply such situations, and they remain just dreams in the minds of many people? What is your take?
Thank you, Tariq. Well, I also worked for the United Nations for a decade. And I can see how, when we look at Syria in particular, how the current international system is not working. And that's what I said, and I'm glad that some of my fellow discussants and panelists have also pointed to that. But what I would say here is that we have an opportunity to build back better. And let me explain how. I actually do believe that the changeover of US presidents to a President Biden with a focus on multilateralism and diplomacy, not the topsy-turvy world of President Trump, actually presents an opportunity. And when it comes to the Middle East, even though this may not be a priority for great powers who are now engaged in this great power competition, particularly the United States and China, in fact, working on building back better, especially when it comes to the humanitarian side, and in the Middle East, where there is the most acute problems, as the UN appeal which just came out shows, particularly with regards to Yemen and Syria. This is an opportunity. There are confidence-building steps which can be made, which help us to build protection for civilians, which help us to build greater resilience for civilians, and also to try to see how we can work more longer term. And certainly in some of the discussions that we've been involved in, I think there is an opportunity to bring not just regional players, but also, I believe, even the United States and China and Russia together for this kind of discussion. And in the case of Syria, the clock is ticking. In 6 months' time, we'll have again a discussion in the Security Council about the border crossing, and there's only one left now in Bab al-Hawa. So I believe this work has to start, and it has to start immediately. And as I said, if we look to see how this COVID experience means that we can build back better, I think we have actually a chance to make 2021 a much more lighter year than the dark tunnel we've been in over the past year or so.
Thank you for this optimistic dose. I will move to Mr. Bara. I believe you have a question.
Yes. For me, it is very, very interesting to see the kind of similarities that are happening between Yemen and Syria on many, many different topics that all of the speakers have addressed. I think one clear similarity was from the beginning. In the Houthi-controlled territory, they tried to control crossings by having isolation centers at the entry of those areas, and it looked like more of a security vetting rather than trying to really isolate, people from suffering from COVID. The question is, when it comes to Yemen, we really came into a situation where we actually suffering from the lack of supporting some of the institutions, especially when I talk about the health institutions that exist, and are being replaced constantly by humanitarian interventions that are not sustainable, that do not resolve the problem on a long-term process, but rather, it provides more temporary doses of sending aid that could be easily be diverted or being used by different factions of the conflict. And the question is rather, do we think that actually the UN at this stage, and especially with all of the reports that have been coming at the beginning of this year, 2020, we saw a very damning report coming from the Associated Press accusing UN agencies of corruption. They have been blackmailed by the Houthis. A lot of their aid beneficiaries have been diverted to help some of the warring parties. What is the extent really of that people like in Yemen or like in Syria can really keep on counting on humanitarian interventions like the UN, where actually the main problem is that the institutions are being deficient. The institutions are being systematically being destroyed. And my fear is that the more humanitarian aid being pumping into the market in the same way, the Yemeni economy will suffer, the institutions will be destroyed very, very soon, and it will be hard for then any intervention on a national level to replace this massive humanitarian intervention, where you see people standing in long queues waiting for their for food baskets or waiting to receive some aid. And we saw this clearly with the COVID-19. The COVID-19 showed how fragile this humanitarian intervention is actually to the situation in Yemen.
Yeah, thank you for your thoughts, and I would like to move to Mr. Ibrahim. I know you raised this very, very important point about the prisons and detention centers being like ticking bombs for COVID, and this contrasts a little bit with some of the optimistic views from some of our panelists that maybe, in fact, this whole COVID thing is just over, and some societies have developed herd immunity, and then there will be nothing now except like economic problems. So there is a bit of discrepancy between the views of the most optimistic people and the most pessimistic people. What can you tell us more about this, the problem of the prisons, and also, of course, if you have any additional points you want to make?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Tariq. So in detention, as we know, over the last couple of years, the situation has been horrendous. We're there from medical attention, their kind of access to healthcare, access to food, access to sanitation, and that automatically puts them into the more vulnerable category that will suffer under COVID. When we hear the most vulnerable people with underlying health conditions, all sorts of things are the people that die from COVID. This kind of fits exactly the criteria of people who are arbitrarily detained and tortured in regime cells. And the only optimistic from the kind of when it comes to the issue of detention would be the regime. It's a God-sent way to get rid of the people that they've detained for so many years. They've used them as a leverage card, and now they can justify that these people died under COVID, that they are not responsible for their death, with nothing but the truth, because they created all the situations that led to their death. So that's just on detention. The second point I wanted to make is to what Christian was saying. I have two fears about national world order. The first is that you need some sort of interest, either a carrot or a stick for countries to come together in this situation, and I don't see that being there yet. And my fear is that even if it does get there, my worry is that the conflicts like Yemen and Syria will just be seen as wars, right? Not areas where crimes were committed. That people fled Syria because of the war, not because of persecution. And so all the crimes that were documented by the Commission of Inquiry, Amnesty, Heinrich Boll in Berlin helped expose with the trials that are happening in Germany and things like that will all be put to the side. Victims and survivors of the worst international crimes ever known to humanity will be put, because now is the time to come together. So I'm also fearing that other actors that committed these international crimes will use COVID as a blank check to be able to say, look, I want to help you work with this COVID situation and trying to come together. And I think that is not really working so far, particularly for Russia, because we've seen when Russia announced that it has the vaccine and it wants to be part of the world dealing with this situation, it wasn't taken as seriously as I think it would have loved to. So I think it's important to kind of remember that the conflicts we're talking about are all kind of man-made and are crime scenes rather than just conflicts.
Well, this is really, really edifying. Thank you very much for that. I think this is really a part of the war of narrative and the information warfare. Some of our discussants have raised this point. I will move to Ömer for some comments. Ömer, you have listened to what Ibrahim has said. It's unfortunate that there is a lot of information warfare going on with this COVID situation. Some people and some regimes are trying to whitewash crimes that were committed into a new narrative. What do you make of that? And of course, if you have any comments, please feel free to share them. And please make sure that's in 2 minutes time, because we are close to the end.
So great. I will be quite brief. So after some optimistic comments, which I personally also think that it would be great if they would be realized, I will be the realist pessimist guy here in this room and say, yes, it would be great that a new international order, new international humanitarian aid would be delivered, and there would be a new system. Everything would be better then, but it will not happen. So if it would have happened, it would have happened earlier, because neither the Syrian war has begun newly, nor the Yemen war has begun newly. And we have seen that the United Nations and international law and international system have actually evolved to a mechanism of protection of the criminals. So this is the main problem. The international law was not established to protect criminals and to continue the suffering of innocent civilians. And I think here, we have to be realistic and pragmatic. If let's assume what would have happened if Turkey would just abruptly, totally withdraw from Idlib. We would see a massive massacre of civilians. We would see a new migration wave. We would see a new humanitarian disaster. And this would even result in major social economic problems in the European Union as the migration flow will go to Europe. The only thing which stands in between this catastrophe and the current situation is the might of Turkey, standing with its army in Idlib and protecting the civilians from Russian bombardments and attack of the Assad regime. So then there is no United Nations army deployed there, and there will be none. Secondly, let's also go forward and think about a more realistic scenario. In the short period, there can be the last border gate of the United Nations to the areas controlled not by the Assad regime, Bab al-Hawa, can be closed in some months. What will happen then? Will we stop delivering humanitarian aid to civilians who suffer because of our respect for not working international law and not working international order? Or will we actually try to help the suffering civilians by going around the United Nations system and working unitarily, working together in a coalition, and working to reach the people? That's the main question. I think the answer to this question lies in the people. Let's just go and try to explain to any innocent civilian in Syria. I will finish up and say him, hey, we want to help you, but first we have to restore international order, and try to explain him that, and then try to implement it here.
Thank you very much for these points. I will move to Abdulghani Al-Iryani for some final comments from the panelists.
Thank you, Mr. Shakawi.
Please, in 2
UN
minutes,
was
if you can be
discussed.
brief.
Yes, of course. The UN has been discussed in this session, and I'd like to point out that the UN bears a huge responsibility for the crisis, the humanitarian crisis in Yemen. The UN Security Council instituted restrictions and sanctions that created the conditions for the two sides of the conflict to weaponize the economy, thereby disempowering the population and making the population more vulnerable for manipulation by these two sides. Then the UN sends its humanitarian agencies to get the population who has been disempowered, partly by international action, to get hooked on handouts, and therefore become dependent and even weaker and less resilient. So the UN should at least begin to remove the conditions that have created this economic disempowerment, and then shift from handouts to helping people economically, empowering them economically. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this final comments. I know we can't tackle every aspect. It's a very, like I said in the beginning, very complex situation, very multifaceted. 1 hour and a half or 2 hours or even one day would not make justice for this important topic and for the peoples that are suffering in Yemen and in Syria. So I would like to conclude this session by thanking everyone and thanking our audiences. I hope we will have another opportunity to discuss these things in depth in the future. Thanks again, and have a lovely evening. Bye-bye.